World War II, where people are taught to be afraid of certain things based on the way that they look or talk or act. And this is also how racism comes into play. And so not all fears have to do with rational decision making based on real danger or threats. Some of them are perceived and some of them are completely erroneous, but nonetheless, they are taught to us by our environments. And it's important to know this. When we feel the fear within us, we can separate out what is rational versus irrational, and that's the return to cognition. But in order to return to cognition and master those fears, or any emotion for that matter, we have to acknowledge what it is that we're feeling right in that moment. And that's why I'm so big on these 10 emotions. If you can identify which one you're feeling at its core, you can embrace it, know that it's yours, and then do something about it with a reasonable approach, rather than if you're avoiding it or stuffing it down or mislabeling it as something else, you're not going to have an appropriate response to your environment. So that's why I'm big on this emotion stuff, because it really matters. It's got evolutionary significance. It's got practical application in healthy communication among other people. And so when I talk about the fear component specifically, we don't want to be unconsciously afraid of things that are not necessarily dangerous. We want to acknowledge this and go, whoa, what am I feeling here? Okay, I'm scared. Why am I scared? Okay, first of all, it has to be okay to be scared too, by the way. If you're taught that fear is not appropriate, it's really hard to get to that point where you can embrace it and make sense of it. So I'm scared. It's okay to be scared. But do I need this fear? And all this can happen in a matter of just a couple of seconds. If you're walking down the street and you see somebody of a race that you've been told is dangerous or to shy away from, you can check that and go, well, what evidence do I have that says that this person of a different skin color is somehow a threat to me? And if reason penetrates, you can override your own fear response. And that's where I want to go with this segue, is the techniques for controlling fear. So we have several. One I just listed, which is the reasonable application of facts and data and logic to the expression of fear that may have been pushed into your head by somebody who didn't have your best interest in mind, or was just doing what they thought was best and inadvertently taught you to be afraid of things that aren't necessarily scary. So that's one way of doing it. Another way is called desensitization. And this technique works toward decreasing somebody's sensitivity to the objects or the situations that cause the fear. It combines relaxation procedures with a repetitive presentation of a graded series of stimuli. So in one example, we can do this with anything. We can do this with spiders. We can do it with the dark. We can do it with heights, certainly. But people have a fear of flying, and so one way of doing this this desensitization is by starting with something small. So maybe if you have a fear of spiders, we might introduce you to. Now that's a bad example. We'll go with fear of flying. A fear of flying. So we might start with a picture of a plane. And then once you can tolerate seeing the picture of the plane, we might do a picture of a plane taking off. And then we have a picture of a plane landing. And then we move to holding a model die-cast plane. And then we move to a larger plane where the propellers turn and maybe it makes noise and lights. And then we move to maybe some guided visual imagery of, can you picture yourself getting on the plane and flying? And so we move through this thing. It's a slow desensitization with ever increasing stimuli, to the point that eventually you're able to get on the plane and have a nice flight without the worry. So the previous one, which is the introduction of rational statistics and data, you may say, well, flying is the safest mode of transportation we have. Well, that may not work for somebody. They're still like, hey, planes can drop out of the air. And, well, yeah, okay, maybe they can. Not very often, though, and certainly not as often as cars crash and claim lives. And yet the same person may not have any problem getting into a car, knowing even that logically that the risk is much higher. So the experience of desensitization has to do with experiencing small bits of fear. And if you think about the wave, it'd be a little tiny wave and a little bit bigger wave after that and a little bit bigger wave after that one. And eventually you build up to the point where you can tolerate the fear itself and not have to bail out of it. So you're carefully and gradually brought through the grades of fear. That's the point. We don't just like rip you through it in one session. It's done over time, and through a lot of heavy monitoring. So that's one way, desensitization. Now, there's something called implosive therapy, and nobody really knows exactly how it works, or so goes the literature. But I do this a lot with my clients, and I'll take you through a technique or an example here in a second. But basically, what it requires is somebody to imagine a highly traumatic event, and then you pull back from it. So what I do is I go to the worst. I just help them imagine the worst case scenario. And in my mind, the reason this works is because you've already imagined the worst possible thing. So then that makes the thing that you're actually facing not so bad. So what I've done is instead of building up a small wave, a little bit bigger wave, a little bit bigger wave, I just go straight to helping them imagine the largest wave of emotion possible and saying, look, you can ride through that, and would life end? No, because emotional experiences don't typically end lives. Although I guess a startle response could stop someone's heart. But again, that's an unexpected consequence. It's an unexpected event. So when you're talking about fear and facing a fear, we go to the extreme. We have them imagine that, and then we say, all right, now do you think you can handle this thing? So let me give that concrete example. Let's take test anxiety. We got maybe a high school senior who needs to take an exam, and there's a lot writing on it. So I'll say, so what happens if you fail? And I don't allow catastrophizing to things that are irrational. So it's like, if I said, what happens if you fail, and the kid says, I'll die, I'll say, well, no, that's not reasonable. That's not on the table. You're not going to die if you fail a test. But let's pretend that you fail the test. You don't graduate, you don't get into school, your parents are massively disappointed. Let's say they even kick you out of the house, and by this time the kid's probably shaking his or her head, going, that's not going to happen, Jake. But I say, go with me on this. Let's say that it actually does happen. You get kicked out of the house, you end up having to work a job you don't want until you can, enroll in community college, reestablish yourself, whatever. And then by that time, I'm already talking to them about the solution, right? The long-term end of tolerating this horrible thing that, let's pretend the worst thing happens. Well, you're still going to land on your feet at some point because I know this person's resilient and whatnot. And if I don't know that, I'll just drop it in their lap and say, like, tell me what the worst thing is. Well, they'll kick me out of my house, and I won't go to college, and I won't get my degree, and I'll be a massive embarrassment to my family, so on and so on and so on. And I go, okay, and then what? Well, I don't know. I guess I'd have to get a job. Okay, and then what? Well, I'd save up. For what? A car, a house, college. I'll get to go to community college. I'll let them lead to their own conclusion. And then we can come back to the test and go, all right, do you think you can take this test now? And then usually they'll look at me and go, well, yeah, I guess. So the anxiety's gone. So that's implosive therapy, where we take the most extreme thing and we move it inward. We take the extremes and we press on them so it implodes. And then we have something called modeling, and that's where so these are all techniques for controlling fear if you're joining us a little bit late. So we have modeling, and that's where someone learns through observation by a trusted individual, usually a loved one, somebody significant. It could be a counselor, actually, or a therapist, who shows the client how to approach and handle situations that might elicit the fear. Parents use this all the time when they show children how to confront and cope with perceived dangers. Now, we don't want to make the mistake of approach, and this is one of Christian Conti's 5 errors of communication. One of them is the error of approach, and it's illustrated by a great parable of the watermelon slayer, and I won't tell it. I'll let him tell it some other day. But the idea is that you can make the error of approach by invalidating somebody's experience by saying, that's not scary. Look, and you just like pick up the thing and throw it or whatever. Like if they're curious about a worm, I've got a toddler. He's curious about all sorts of insects, and he might be afraid of a worm. He's not. He loves them. He plays with them. But he might be afraid of a worm, and I'll go pick up the worm and be like, that's not scary. That's something that belongs in the garden. I'll just pick it up and throw it away. Well, what have I just taught him? I've taught him that his emotion of fear doesn't matter, that I'm not going to listen to him, he doesn't have an audience, and that worms are to be discarded. And I don't want to teach that to my kid. What I want to teach him is, respect for life and appropriate, order in the hierarchy of the food chain and all sorts of things. So if he's afraid of the worm, I would come alongside him and say, "Ooh, yeah, let's see what's scary about that worm, and I'll make him tell me what he thinks is scary, and he might not be able to. So I might actually literally put words in his mouth, because that's my job as a parent, is to teach what fear is, and I want to teach all emotions. I want to label them accurately, because where else is he going to find it out? Television? Social media? I don't want him doing that. I want to control my kid. And allegedly I'm some sort of expert in emotionality. So of course I would think I'm the best one to teach him this. But I'm his dad too. And I want him to rely on me, and I want to have credibility. So I'll approach him and be like, "Ooh, yeah, that does look like a scary worm. Do you think it's really scary?" Yeah, it's really scary, Dad. Okay, well, what's scary about it? It wiggles. Oh, now is that interesting, or is it scary? And he might go, "It's interesting." And then if he doesn't, I'll just say, "I think it's interesting." Also, I'll talk him into something that's not scary. The worms aren't scary. They don't have to be scary. They can be interesting. So I'll help him accurately label things. But that's known as modeling, where I go up and I approach the thing and I demonstrate that it's not as scary as he makes it out to be. And then we've got something called emotion regulating emotion. And that's where you can actually face a fear and channel something different to override it and help cope with it. So anger can absolutely help override fear, especially in the case of attacks like assaults and batteries and purse snatchings and that kind of thing. So if you're afraid in the moment, and you don't want to be afraid because it paralyzes you, and I'll touch on that in just a second, anger can help motivate to defend and strike and run away even. Or run after, if that's necessary. But I mentioned the paralyzing. So we often talk in terms of fight or flight, or fight, flight, or freeze. Fear is said to cause at least two of those: the fleeing, and the freezing. Fighting is usually done out of anger or contempt, and I cover those in the other podcast. But when you freeze, we don't really know why this happens, but the suggestion is, again, an evolutionary one that seems to hint at freezing, because there are some predators who prefer moving objects as their prey. So maybe many years ago, we would pause and just hope that we could blend in. And there's lots of evidence across the animal kingdom for this, where people freeze in place, hoping that they're not seen, and then they don't become prey to the predators. So we can have a fight or flight, and then the freeze comes in. All of this is done out of the root of fear. So remember that fear is its purpose is to tell us that there's a threat or a danger present, and it can be both rational and irrational based on how we're taught. And it can be it can be both a physical threat to self or others, or it can be an ideological threat to ideas. And I want to spend just a little bit of time on that ideological fear part, and help you understand what I mean by this. If I have a belief system and I don't care to have it challenged, it may not necessarily align with reality. So if I believe, we'll go back to the racism example for a second. If I believe, for those of you who haven't looked me up, I'm a white man, just putting that out there. So if I happen to have a belief that people of color are dangerous, right? So I've got this belief that they're scary, and I don't want anything to do with them. I'm not, by the way. I'm very proudly integrated in my community. But I may have that. So I have this view of the world that says that people of color are scary. And now that's an irrational fear, because I don't have any evidence to support it. I haven't been, robbed and beaten by only people of color in my life or anything like that. So we'll just pretend that it's irrational. It was planted there by something else. Now, as I go through life, what I mean by doesn't align with reality, I'm going to have to encounter the very obvious reality that people of color are not scary. They're quite pleasant. They're all human beings, just like I am. We all have the same capacity for great and terrible. And so as I go through my life and I see repeated evidence that people of color are not scary, I'm going to have to integrate that somehow. Integrating it means I have to let go of my belief that they are scary. Now, that in and of itself could trigger fear, because I'm having to let go of something and I don't necessarily have something to replace it with. That uncertainty, that imbalance, that not knowing what's coming can breed anxiety. It can breed a fear. So that in and of itself it's an accurate fear. It's an it's a legitimate fear. It's a rational fear because I'm having to let go of my belief system, and I don't necessarily have anything with which to replace it. When I say